Eric Archer here from TI, and today we're going to explore natural selection. And this is a really fun activity. I think you'll agree. We're going to use a pretty powerful simulation that uses virtual rabbits, virtual bunny rabbits. They're hopping around all over the place. They're trying to avoid being eaten. We've got white rabbits and brown rabbits, long-tailed rabbits, long-toothed rabbits, and we have wolves. And so the rabbits are trying to avoid the wolves. And the simulation also gives us the ability to change the environment in which the rabbits are roaming. So really cool. We're going to explore 4 different parts today to get you some understanding of concepts under natural selection. We're going to do some review of genotype and phenotype. If that's not review for you, then we'll make sure we cover it in depth so you know what those terms mean, as well as some other terms related to Mendelian genetics, natural selection, and evolution. All right, now to run this file, you need to go to our website at www.TI-Nspire.com. Under biology, the title of the lesson is natural selection. And then to use the software, you need to have our to use the file, you need to have our software, which is the TI-Nspire CX Premium software, which can be found at www.education.ti.com. Or you can use this file on your TI-Nspire CX or CX2 graphing calculator. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and get started on natural selection. Okay, so now I have the file open, the file called natural selection from scienceinspire.com. Open up in my TI-Nspire CX premium software. Again, you can do this on the handheld as well. It will look something like this. I like this little slide sorter. It just helps me navigate a little bit better, so I'm going to keep that open. And this first page just talks about a little bit of background on the simulation. There are 2 tabs within the simulation. There's a setup tab, which lets us adjust various factors and parameters to observe the effects of making some changes to variables. So let's jump over there. Now you'll see we have 2 tabs, the setup tab and the actual simulation tab here. And we're going to start at the equator. We can add mutations such as white fur, long teeth, or long tail. We're just going to start with the long tail. We can make the mutation dominant or recessive. We'll start with recessive. And then we can introduce that mutation after some number of generations. I think it goes up to 8. We'll start at 3. Now for this first part, part 1, we're not going to have a selection factor, so we'll select none. We just want to see what happens to a population of bunnies. Once a mutation's introduced to the population, just kind of observe what happens if there are any changes based on the alleles in that population. So up here in the menu, and you can access this on your calculator by pressing the menu key, we can adjust the speed of how fast the simulation goes, and I chose fast. And then we can show the chart, and you'll see this in the actual simulation part here in a minute. So there's a little part of it, it's just a quarter part of a whole pie chart. And this is looking at the long tail recessive traits. There's actually nothing here right now, but that's just a visual indicator to let you know there is a chart. So you'll see that pop up or adjust after the 3rd generation, because that's when we'll introduce this mutation, this long tail mutation. Otherwise, the population of bunnies is going to have this short tail, which is the dominant allele in the population. So even if a rabbit's heterozygous for the trait called tail length, meaning that they have one allele from mom that's, say, dominant, the short tail, and one allele from dad that's recessive, say the long tail. Because the short tail is dominant, it means that it will be expressed over the long tail. So dominant alleles are expressed over the expression of recessive alleles. Okay, and we'll see more of that as we play with the variables. So I started the simulation. You'll notice the generations here. We start off with 2 bunnies, and those bunnies quickly grow, reproduce, and into more bunnies. And so as we go through the 3rd generation now, you'll notice that the chart should appear, and or part of the chart should appear as the recessive long tail mutations introduced, and it looks like there are no bunnies expressing long tails right now, which is not surprising. We're going to go through, I think we'll go through the end of generation 6, and then it's kind of sort of debrief on what we have observed. Oh, there it is right there. There's a little sliver of the chart. Let it go through one more generation, see if anything changes here. So we'll go through generation 8. Man, we're getting a bunch of rabbits. Well, about the same. Okay, I'm going to pause it here. Let's talk about a few concepts you guys need to know. One of those is what's a phenotype? So we've addressed that indirectly. The phenotype is basically what you see, what's expressed. So if we're looking at the phenotype of, say, the trait tail length, short tail seems to dominate the population here. All of these little bunnies have a short tail. It looks like there's at least one, maybe a couple of bunnies that have long tails. It's hard to see though in this mix of rabbits. But the phenotype's what's expressed, what you actually see. Now, because long tail's recessive, that would mean that an individual that has a long tail has to have both alleles that are recessive, because that's the only way you would see the long tail. And we can see in the population that's not many. There aren't, a majority of rabbits have short tails. So the ones that are expressing the phenotype of a short tail, they could be either heterozygous or homozygous dominant. So that means that their mom and dad could both give them the dominant allele, the short tail allele, or one parent could give them the the short tail allele, and the other parent could give them the long tail allele. But because in tail length, the trait tail length, short tails rule, you're only going to see the short tail appear because it's the dominant trait. Okay, so that's basically a description of phenotype. Another question is, how would you expect the simulation to be different if there were a selective advantage to one trait? So if there were an advantage to a particular trait, you would expect those individuals to be more likely to survive and then pass on that trait to the next generation. So in this case, there's no selective selection factor. Wolves aren't eating any of the bunnies. There's doesn't seem to be a hunger issue. Long tails don't seem to be necessarily advantageous over short tails. So everything's pretty much status quo, just a bunch of short-tailed rabbits reproducing one generation after the other. Okay, another question is, after 6 generations, how many rabbits show the dominant phenotype versus the recessive phenotype? Well, the dominant phenotype is the majority of the population. So if we said let's say there's 50, 60 rabbits here, maybe 1 or 2 of those have long tails. So clearly the short tail dominant allele is being expressed much more than the recessive long tail allele. All right, next question. Can you determine the genotype of the rabbits in the simulation? If so, what is it? Well, you can determine the phenotype, what's physically expressed, but the genotype is something different. The genotype is the actual genetics that influence what you see, and we've talked about this. So the genotype for rabbits expressing short tails could be one of 2 things. It could be, and if we use the letter T, for example, or for tail length, capital T would be the dominant allele, and lowercase t would be the recessive allele. So all of these rabbits that have short tails are either showing, either have a genotype of capital T, or capital T, lowercase t. But I can't tell you which of these rabbits has that genotype or has one or the other. So it's really impossible to tell if they're homozygous dominant or heterozygous. The only thing we can tell is on the long-tailed recessive rabbits, so the rabbits that have long tails, we know for a fact their genotype would be little t, because the only way they would express the phenotype long tail would be if they had the genotype little t. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, another question is, would you predict most or few rabbits will show the recessive mutation versus no mutation after 6 generations? Well, I mean, we kind of saw what was going to happen, or what did happen rather, with the recessive mutation. Majority of rabbits don't show it. They don't express it, mainly because in order to express it, the individual rabbit would have to have both alleles. And without selection, without there being a selection factor, like in this case wolves or hunger, most rabbits are going to show the wild type trait, which is short tail in this case, not the mutation. All right. Next question is, how would you expect the simulation to be different if there were a selective advantage to a particular trait? I mean, for the answer for this one, I think you can think through it. If one trait were to increase the fitness of an individual with that trait, they are more likely to have the chance to pass on that favorable trait. So they either get more food or they're less likely to be eaten by a predator. Therefore, they get the opportunity to reproduce, to have offspring, and those offsprings, after a few generations, less fit traits may be depleted in the population, and more favorable traits will increase in the population. You would expect to see the advantageous trait to be more common in the population after some number of generations. In this particular situation where there's no selective factor, the simulation will keep it at a constantly low level in the population. But we're going to experiment here in a little bit with the selection factor to see what happens if we make a change. Okay, so I've reset the simulation, and we're going to go over to the Setup tab. This time we're going to run the simulation with the selection factor. We're going to select hunger, and we're going to introduce a mutation called long teeth. That mutation, we're going to make it dominant in the population. And so, and same thing after 3 generations. So we're still in the equator. We're going to introduce the long teeth mutation, which is going to be dominant, and it will be introduced after 3 generations. Selection factor is hunger in this case. And so let's go ahead and run that. So we'll see long teeth is dominant, short teeth is recessive. We're starting off with short teeth rabbits because the mutation of long teeth has not been introduced. So the little pie chart that may or may not appear over here, think about that. If it documents the recessive allele, will we expect to see it if there's an advantage to having long teeth? So we'll have to see what happens there. And remember, that chart won't pop up until after the 3rd generation. Okay, so the little pictures are different kinds of food. The food is difficult to eat. So long teeth may be an advantage. All right, so there's the 3rd generation. There's a little piece of pie chart showing that only a small portion of the population is short teeth. Majority of the population is now long teeth. And look at those rabbits just disappearing. These poor hungry rabbits. They can't eat the food, and those who can't eat the food won't live long enough to reproduce. And if those rabbits can't reproduce, then their genes are going to start to disappear in the population. And that's exactly what we're seeing. All right, so every now and then you'll see some short teeth rabbits appear, but it's very, very few. Let's let this go to the end of the 10th generation. We'll see if any changes occur. And that's about it. All right, I'm going to pause it there. So let's kind of go over what we've observed. So we introduced the mutation after the 3rd generation. There are very few short teeth rabbits left in the population. They didn't seem to recover from not being able to eat this food, whereas the long-toothed rabbit, they were proliferating just fine. And so so clearly the population's dominated by long-toothed rabbits. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to some questions here. Let's see. I think, which traits appear to give a selective advantage against hunger in this simulation? Explain why you think so. Obviously, long teeth are a selective advantage in that you're the rabbits are trying to eat food that's difficult to eat with short teeth. So the short teeth rabbits, they can't consume that food, therefore they don't live long enough to reproduce for the next generation. Long teeth rabbits rule in this particular scenario with hard to eat food. All right. So another question, in general terms, how does a phenotype provide a selective advantage to an animal? And we saw that, right? I mean, we saw that the long-toothed rabbits with the phenotype long teeth had a competitive advantage over the short-teeth rabbits in terms of eating. All right, so now what I want to do is change this back to long teeth. Sorry about that. Yeah, clicked the wrong one. Our mutation this time, let's, instead of it being dominant, let's make it recessive. So in the simulation we just ran, we had long teeth was a mutation introduced after 3 generations, and it was dominant. This time we're going to run it as recessive, and let's just see what happens here. So I'm just going to double check, make sure. I want to show my charts. All right, it's showing a chart there. I don't know. I think it may reset here in a second, and we want to make it fast. So ignore the chart until after the 3rd generation. All right, here we go. Little bunnies hopping around, trying to eat some food, reproducing, which is good. Now, the dominant allele in this case is the short teeth. So think about what you would expect. If the food's hard to eat with short teeth, would you see rabbits lasting very long, or even reproducing for that matter? So think about the simulation before when the alleles were reversed. Long teeth was dominant, short teeth were recessive. I wonder if my chart's showing up here. And generation 8, not that many bunnies. If you remember, after Gen 6, Gen 7, and the previous simulation, we had tons and tons of bunnies. Oh, there's a little something. Let's see what happens there. Gen 12. Very few bunnies left. But notice that pie chart. We're at generation 14. We'll probably let this run to maybe generation 20. Look at that. In the last few generations, we went from hardly any long-toothed rabbits to mostly long-toothed rabbits. So the short teeth dominant allele is still in the population, but not much. All right, let's go ahead and stop that. So that was interesting. So we saw a transition from short-toothed rabbits, very few members of the population, to long-toothed rabbits, and it looks like there's a lot more members in the population now. So that's an interesting variation on the simulation. Now let's look at some questions now related to that. So how does the result of the simulation change when you introduce the advantageous mutation as a recessive mutation instead of a dominant mutation? Well, we saw a couple things. One, the dominant population, the dominant allele in the population, it has a negative effect on the population numbers. So long teeth we know is advantageous over short teeth, but it took a long time for the recessive allele, the long tooth phenotype to show up in the population. It took way more than 6 generations. It took about, I think it was about 15 generations before we saw it appear. And then once it appeared, it took over pretty fast. So that leads me into question 10. How does the rabbit population change when there is a selection factor in the population in contrast to no selection factor? So when we did this the first time with no selection factor, the population really didn't change all that much. The balance of dominant to recessive was about the same, mostly dominant. But in this case, with a selection factor and a recessive advantageous mutation, that mutation did show up in the population after a long number of generations, and then it actually took over. It became the dominant. I'm sorry, I should rephrase that. It's still a recessive mutation, but it became the most common phenotype in the population. Even though it was recessive, it was still the most common. So not always is it that the dominant allele is the most common. In this case, you saw it was actually the recessive allele because there is an advantage to it being in the population versus the dominant allele. Pretty cool. Okay, so I've made some changes in the setup because we want to do this selection by wolves this time. We changed our environment to Arctic. Add the mutation we're going to add after the third generation will be white fur. So we'll start off with brown fur. Mutation will be dominant, and we'll do that again after 3 generations with a wolf selection factor. I just want to make sure I reset that again and press play. It's important when you do the simulation, make sure you reset it to make sure it wipes out all the previous variables that were being tracked. All right, so here we go. A couple brown rabbits hanging out on the Arctic, and you know, it takes 2 rabbits to reproduce to make more rabbits, and so we've got some bunnies. There's a good discussion about that too. If you only have 2 rabbits to start with, are you really having a variation in the population? You know, of course the answer is not really. But for simulations, this is a good model for us to sort of understand the mechanisms behind natural selection. All right, so what do we got here? So the brown fur phenotype starting to disappear a little bit. The wolves are picking off the brown rabbits pretty quick. And you can see that by that little chart. Those wolves look pretty mean. Oh, those poor brown bunnies. So now start thinking about why is it that the brown phenotype's disappearing? Is it because it's recessive? Or is there something else going on? Or is it a combination of factors? We'll let this go to about Gen 15. My oh my, mostly white rabbits. And here's generation 15. There aren't many brown rabbits left. All right, we'll go ahead and stop it there. You know, just kind of think through what you just witnessed, what just happened. You know, obviously wolves were taking out some brown rabbits. As sad as that may be, remember this is just a simulation, so don't be too sad. Really, this was a good tool for us to try to ask some questions and get answers to those questions. One of those questions is, you know, which phenotype would you have predicted would have been the most common after 9 generations? Well, I mean, you know, the simulation is really helpful in showing us that the white fur was the most dominant phenotype to be in the population. So I want to know why. You know, why is it the most why did white fur show up the most? Is it because it's the dominant allele? Because we started off with recessive alleles, recessive phenotype, the brown fur. But look at the environment. And so the wolves, you know, they hunt by sight and smell, and you know, let's assume all these bunnies have the same scent. of sights the difference. Obviously, the white rabbits are going to blend into this new environment more so than those brown rabbits, and so camouflage has a big effect on who lives and who dies in the bunny population. So very interesting simulation. All right, so would your prediction have been correct? My guess is probably so. I think you guys probably have seen enough of this to realize what would have happened. And then so question 13, when wolves are performing natural selection, which phenotypes give the selective advantage? What do the rabbits that are most likely to survive look like under the conditions in this part of the simulation? So white rabbits survive best in the Arctic, brown rabbits survive best in the equator, and so obviously the environment has a huge role in this. There's another activity too on TI-Nspire.com called Moths Around a Flame. There's a video for it as well that gets into camouflage specifically and the challenges of the peppered moth in England over the course of the Industrial Revolution. It gets into this whole scenario big time. All right, so another question is, how would the simulation change when the advantageous trait is dominant versus recessive? And so in this case, the white fur was dominant. If we were to flip that, because white fur is still advantageous, it would eventually dominate the population, but it would take many more generations for that to actually happen. So we saw that before. It was a similar situation with the long teeth and the hunger selection factor. So definitely the recessive mutation that's advantageous would still become the most common in the population. Another question is, how does the choice of environment influence natural selection? Do you get the same or different results in the Arctic and at the equator? Well, man, that's going to be fun. Let's see what happens here. So I'll just leave these parameters the same. I'm going to go ahead and press play. We'll continue, the simulation, and I'm going to switch the environment now. So now, got a bunch of those white rabbits, but now that the brown rabbits are more camouflaged than the white rabbits, we should see this pie chart increase after each generation. Let's see if that's what happens. Looks like that's what's happening now. I'll give it a couple of generations. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you see, I mean, from where we started, where this was mostly white rabbits, now we're just about half and half, brown rabbits to white rabbits, and I think we can all predict that if I were to let this go for 30, 40, 50 generations, and by the way, you can do that, you would see the brown rabbits take over. Okay. All right. With that, that's the end of this lesson, end of this video. Please check out our YouTube channel for more science and math videos for students, and check out TI-Nspire.com. Remember, you can get the software to run these files from our website at www.education.ti.com. With that, thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.